Los Angeles, January 1965. A city that glittered on the surface. Hollywood lights, luxury cars, and red carpets. But beneath the glamour, a darkness simmered. Hidden in plain sight were neighborhoods forgotten by progress, where the city's dreams faded into concrete shadows. On the outskirts of downtown stood an abandoned church, weather-beaten and shrouded in silence. But that silence was shattered one night when police, armed with rifles and flashlights, kicked open its chained doors. Inside, a scene from a nightmare. Candlelight flickering over blood-stained fabric. Ritualistic symbols scrawled on the walls, and a man, calm, smiling, sitting before a makeshift altar. That man was Vaughn Greenwood. He didn't run. He didn't speak. He simply waited, as if he knew this moment had always been his fate. 11 men were dead, each victim butchered in near-identical fashion. But who was this man, and why had he turned murder into a ritual? To answer that, we must go back, not just to where the crimes began, but to where the killer was born. This isn't just the story of murders. It's the story of a boy lost in the cracks of a broken system, and what happens when that boy grows into something far more dangerous than anyone imagined. Vaughn Orrin Greenwood was born in 1944 in rural Pennsylvania, a place of cold winters and harder lives. His parents, young and unprepared, abandoned him before he could walk. From the very beginning, Vaughn belonged to no one. Passed from one foster home to the next, he grew up in unfamiliar beds under unfamiliar roofs, learning early that love was conditional and often absent. In one home, he was neglected. In another, beaten. Some were overrun with too many children. Others were cold, sterile places where silence filled the rooms like full. Social workers noted he was quiet, withdrawn, emotionally distant, one file read. But no one stayed long enough to ask why. Vaughn learned how to vanish, into corners, into books, into silence. His presence became ghost-like. He developed no attachments, made no friends. He trusted no one. By the age of 10, he'd begun to speak of strange things, voices only he could hear, visions of blood and cleansing. But those claims were brushed off as childhood imagination. He was just odd, they said. Quiet. Teachers passed him through grades with minimal attention. He was small, thin, and forgettable. But beneath that invisibility, something was festering, something dark. As Vaughn moved into adolescence, the neglect of his childhood evolved into something more dangerous. Without structure, without affection, he found his own code, one shaped by instinct, fear, and the absence of consequence. By 14, he had run away from his latest foster home and was living on the streets of Chicago. Cold, crowded, and cruel, the city was both battleground and classroom. Vaughn survived by theft, manipulation, and invisibility. He blended in with the other nameless faces of urban poverty, boys who slept in abandoned buildings, hustled at intersections, or vanished into the steam of subway tunnels. He began to experiment with control, stealing not out of need, but to feel power, provoking fights with strangers, setting fires in alleyways, then standing nearby to watch them burn. Social workers caught up with him a few times. Reports documented a boy who didn't respond to discipline, who seemed incapable of empathy. In one psychological assessment, a counselor wrote, "Detached, possibly sociopathic tendencies, no known support network." The next few years were a blur of juvenile detentions, street arrests, and court-ordered therapy sessions that Vaughn barely attended. He would vanish for months only to be picked up again for shoplifting or trespassing. In 1962, he was arrested for breaking into a church basement. When questioned, he said he wanted to talk to God alone. The police didn't press charges, assuming he was just another disturbed runaway. But for Vaughn, that basement became something else entirely, a sanctuary. It was there he began writing, journals filled with strange diagrams, religious phrases twisted into mantras, and an obsession with purification. Blood, he wrote, was the gateway to truth. In early 1963, he attacked a man in a homeless shelter with a broken bottle. The attack was unprovoked. The man needed 37 stitches. Vaughn was arrested and charged with assault with a deadly weapon. During the subsequent psychiatric evaluation, doctors noted signs of severe paranoid schizophrenia. He spoke about voices, about being chosen. He believed he had been given a mission, but the system failed him, and the public, despite clear red flags. Vaughn was not hospitalized. He was sentenced to a short term in prison and released with no supervision. After his release, he vanished from records again. The streets swallowed him whole. But this time, something inside him had shifted. The boy who had once wanted to disappear now wanted to be seen, through fear, through ritual, through blood. Greenwood headed west to Los Angeles, a city where no one knew his name, a city large enough to get lost in and to begin his real work. When Vaughn Greenwood stepped into Los Angeles in the mid-1960s, the city didn't notice. It was easy to go unnoticed in Skid Row, a place where the forgotten were expected to vanish. In 1964, a homeless man was found dead behind a liquor store, his throat cut from ear to ear. The wound was clean, too clean. The coroner described it as surgical. But the victim had no ID, no family, and no one to raise alarm. The case was filed away as another unsolved tragedy. Months passed, then another body. Same method, same signature. Only this time there were strange markings on the pavement beside the corpse. Chalk symbols that didn't match any known gang signs. A cracked ceramic cup, crusted with what appeared to be blood, lay near his outstretched hand. Police began to whisper about a connection, but with no fingerprints, no eyewitnesses, and no outcry from the public, nothing could be done. The victims were invisible in life, and remained so in death. Greenwood was perfecting his methods. He stalked the alleys late at night, blending in with the crowd. He spoke softly, if at all. To some, he offered drinks. To others, he simply watched, always calm, always calculating. He believed he was purifying the streets. Each kill was not an act of rage, but of duty. In his mind, he was saving the city from what only he understood. By 1965, the murders suddenly stopped. The city exhaled, assuming the killer had moved on or died. No one knew that Greenwood had been arrested for burglary and was quietly serving time. For 9 years, Los Angeles was safe. But the killer had not vanished. He was only waiting. When Vaughn Greenwood was released from prison in late 1973, Los Angeles had changed, but Skid Row hadn't. The streets were still littered with broken bottles, the cries of the homeless, and the cold, indifferent rhythm of urban decay. Greenwood didn't return to start over. He returned to finish what he believed had been interrupted. This time, he had a system, a belief, a purpose. The first body appeared in October 1974, then another, and another. In just a few short months, the death toll rose to 11. All victims were older, male, homeless. Most were found in alleys or behind dumpsters, their throats slashed with almost ritualistic precision. Some were washed post-mortem, others had symbols carved into their skin, and always nearby, a vessel, often a cup, filled with blood. The media caught on, and panic spread. The killer was dubbed the Skid Row Slasher. Theories ranged from a deranged cult to a rogue doctor, but nobody suspected Greenwood, just another silent face among the forgotten. Greenwood escalated. He began arranging bodies. One victim was placed seated upright, arms folded across his chest like a monk. Another had eyes taped open, staring into nothing. He saw himself not as a killer, but as a priest, a cleanser. Each act was a sacrament, performed with precision and silence. He believed the blood held power, that collecting it gave him strength and control. The homeless community became gripped by terror. Men stopped sleeping alone. Shelters overflowed. Some carried weapons, others simply prayed. But Greenwood remained undetected, slipping through the cracks as easily as he always had. Police were overwhelmed. With no fingerprints, no DNA tools like those today, and a population with few records, the investigation stalled. Greenwood had turned the system's neglect into his camouflage. It was a cold night in January when everything changed. William Graham, a transient man with a history of alcoholism, stumbled into a free clinic, his neck bleeding, eyes wide with fear. He told a harrowing story. A man had offered him something to drink, then suddenly lunged with a knife. Graham had fought back, barely escaping with his life. The blade had missed his artery by inches. Graham remembered one word from the attacker's ramblings: cleanse. And he remembered a name, Vaughn. The details set off alarms. Investigators recalled interviews from years prior. A strange man named Vaughn hanging around soup kitchens, offering drinks in rusted cups. Now they had a survivor and a lead. A letter found near the scene, stained with blood, was addressed to a Vaughn Greenwood. It matched records of a man recently released from prison. Detectives began to connect the dots. His prior assault, his mental health reports, his obsession with ritual and blood. Within days, they located him in a long-abandoned church on the fringes of Skid Row. The doors were chained, the windows blacked out. When officers entered, they found Greenwood seated calmly before an altar. Around him were candles, blood-stained robes, ritual bowls, handwritten journals filled with disturbing philosophies. He did not resist. He did not speak. He only smiled. At trial, he showed little emotion. Sometimes he whispered. Sometimes he laughed to himself. He claimed nothing, confessed to nothing, But the evidence, blood samples, belongings of victims, and his writings spoke for him. Vaughn Greenwood was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He would never walk free again. But the terror he caused left scars that never fully healed. Vaughn Greenwood died in prison in 2020, alone, forgotten. No visitors, no mourners, but his legacy remains. The Skid Row slasher case exposed more than just the horror of his crimes. It revealed the fragility of a system unable to protect its most vulnerable citizens. Skid Row, even decades later, remains a symbol of institutional neglect. A neighborhood where cycles of addiction, poverty, and mental illness continue to spiral. For some, Greenwood was a wake-up call. For others, a story too terrible to retell. In the years following his arrest, numerous studies were launched to understand how someone like Greenwood could operate undetected. The conclusion was always the same. Society didn't see the victims, and because it didn't see them, it didn't see the killer either. Several cold cases from Chicago and Bakersfield were quietly reopened in the 1980s, bearing Greenwood's signature. Though never confirmed, some investigators believe his body count may be closer to 20. His journals, kept under seal for decades, were eventually used in criminal psychology courses. Phrases like, "the unclean must be broken open," and "blood is not the end, it is the beginning," offer chilling insight into a mind ruled by delusion and doctrine. Survivors from Skid Row recall him. Some say he gave them food. Others remember only a quiet man who smiled too long. In the end, Greenwood didn't hide behind a mask. He hid in plain sight. The case changed how Los Angeles policed its streets. More outreach programs emerged. More effort was made to track transient populations. But change was slow, and for many, too late. Greenwood is a lesson in what happens when the unseen go unprotected. A portrait of a man shaped by abandonment, driven by hallucination, and empowered by society's apathy. His story forces a hard question. How many others like him walk among us, ignored, untreated, and waiting for their moment? Evil doesn't always knock loudly. Sometimes it whispers, sometimes it waits, and sometimes it wears the face of a man you barely notice. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like and subscribe. I look forward to seeing you in the next one.